Welcome back. Now, in a moment, we'll be examining child slavery. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. More than 70% of migrants travelling overland through North Africa to Europe have become victims of human trafficking, organ trafficking and exploitation. That's according to new figures from the UN's International Organization for Migration. The research surveyed 9,000 migrants during a 10-month investigation. And a vigil has been held for Olympic sprinter Tyson Gay's 15-year-old daughter in her hometown of Kentucky. The teenager was shot and killed outside a restaurant over the weekend. 3 men have been charged in connection with the incident, including a father and son. Well, earlier in the programme, we heard from a woman who was trafficked from Nigeria to the UK to work as a prostitute against her will. But children are also victims of modern slavery. In the world's poorest countries, nearly 1 in 4 children between the ages of 5 to 14 are forced to work against their will. The United Nations says that children make up more than a quarter of the world's slaves. An estimated 5.5 million are working in some form of slavery. These children find themselves in positions of forced labour, prostitution, domestic servitude, and fighting as soldiers in conflict zones. UNICEF estimated that 300,000 child soldiers are involved in over 30 areas of conflict worldwide. That includes young girls taken as wives for soldiers. Well, let's discuss this further. I'm joined in the studio by Debbie Beadle, who's the head of youth development programme ECPAT UK, a charity which campaigns against child trafficking and exploitation. And with us on Skype is Kevin Bales, a professor of contemporary slavery and also the co-founder of Free the Slaves, a global organisation set up to end modern-day slavery. Kevin, let's start with you, because you actually went undercover to meet both slaves and the perpetrators. Can I ask you, it must have been a difficult job. What shocked you most about child slavery?
Well, you know, the parts that really hurt me, and I have to say shocked me, were very early in my research time when I would be in, for example, brothels, not tourist brothels, but just working class brothels in Thailand. And I began to meet 13, 14, and 15-year-old girls who had been enslaved into prostitution there, and who were fundamentally living under a death sentence. If it was not HIV that was going to kill them, it was going to be the brutality of their pimps. Girls were often just murdered in front of each other in order to maintain discipline and control. That was very early in my research, and that was at a time when I wasn't working to bring slavery to end, just first to understand it. And it was that hopelessness that I saw that deeply affected me.
And how had they got to that point? Had they been sold into slavery by their families? Had they been abducted? How did it work?
Well, you know, people use that term, I would say, sold into slavery by their families, but very often the families are actually responding to what they perceive to be an opportunity. In fact, all around the world, and I know Debbie can talk about this as well, all around the world, people are usually being victimized because they want to seek opportunities to make lives better for themselves or for their children.
Debbie, as Kevin says, these children end up in these positions because they are clearly, this is not what they're hoping for, but they're trying to help their families. You've worked with children who have been in the most terrible of circumstances. How do you help them? How do you help them recover from this?
Well, I run 2 youth groups, one for young men and boys and one for young females and girls. And as Kevin said, a lot of the time, you know, they weren't aware what they were coming to the UK to do. They were being told they're going to come for an education or that they were going to work and they were going to send money back home to their parents. And then, so a lot of them have ended up, as you've explained, in sex exploitation and domestic servitude. And the fact that they're children almost makes them extra vulnerable, because often they're going under the instruction of adults, under people that they've trusted, you know, who they've put their trust in to come here, and then exploited and, as you said, traumatized in the most horrendous ways. So what you really need to do is to try and, you know, give them back their dignity, give them back their rights, you know, an education, a stable environment for them to, you know, flourish and become, you know, like positive, you know, young people that can add to society, which is what they want to do.
What's astonishing is that this can go on under our noses. It can be happening anywhere, in any building, in what is, to all intents and purposes, a civilized country.
Well, yes, and you know, lots of the young women that I work with who have been used as domestic slaves in a house. So they've often been taking these people's children to school and been waiting outside the school gates. You know, sometimes they're 12, 13. No one has ever said, well, hang on, you know, why aren't you in school yourself? And often it's very much still seen, and unfortunately it is seen as a bit of a cultural thing. Oh, well, that's what people do in that culture, so actually we're going to turn a blind eye to that. Or,
but why aren't they saying that?
because I think people are afraid. They're afraid to challenge. They're afraid, you know, we've become very insular. So people are just, you know, wrapped up in their own lives and often won't think, well, actually, there's something not quite right there. And the truth is, you know, most people, when you see something that's not quite right, you get that feeling in your stomach, you know, that gut feeling. And so what I always say is, you know, if you get that gut feeling that something's quite not right, so both within the general public, you know, with teachers, with social workers, when you get that feeling, you know, don't be afraid to ask questions because that could make a big difference.
Kevin, the only reason this trade goes on is because it's lucrative. This is big business.
Oh, indeed it is. About 150 billion dollars a year, estimated by the United Nations. And of course, it feeds on vulnerability because it is those children and those adults who cannot actually usually protect themselves or are not protected by the rule of law in the countries where they live, who are taken into slavery. And of course, the key thing about child slavery is that while women are more vulnerable than men to enslavement, children are more vulnerable than men or women. So children, in a sense, are the prime fruit to be picked by slave holders.
And how easy is it to identify slaveholders, to penetrate these gangs, and ultimately to stop them?
It's a very interesting question because with slavery in pretty much every single country in the world, the answer in a country like the United Kingdom is that it's difficult. You have to really dig down deeply behind the veneer of criminal activity, which they want to remain hidden, to find people who are holding children and others in slavery. But in many countries around the world where it is more culturally acceptable, where the rule of law has broken down, where corruption is pretty endemic, you can sometimes see it right there in front of you, right on the street or in the field.
Indeed. And Debbie, what happens to these children once they are rescued? Do they go home? Are they helped? Is there a network system?
Well, you heard from Andrew before that, you know, for adults there's this system, like they go through the NRM system, and that is the same for children, but generally what will happen is they'll go into local authority care. Unfortunately, especially the children that come to the UK legally, often they may go through things like age disputes. So social services may say, actually, we don't believe you're that age, and then they'll go through this lengthy process of, you know, determining their age and how much support they can get. And obviously that's really harrowing for a child. First of all, we're saying, you know, I know that you've been exploited, but actually we're not believing you, you know. So once someone's saying we're not believing you about the age, how is that child then meant to trust in telling the police, trusting telling people their story when they're not being believed about their age?
How are they supposed to put their entire lives back together again anyway?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't begin to imagine how one recovers from this kind of experience.
It takes a long, long time because, you know what, even when they get back into education and, you know, they go into a foster care placement and, you know, generally they don't get back home because they may have lost contact with their families or were orphaned. But you know what, they're then a long way behind, you know, the British national children for things like going for jobs, you know, getting into college placements because, you know, things like their English literacy is very good. They've missed out on years of education. So it's really, really challenging to kind of get back on their feet. And clearly then there's a big draw for them to go back into exploitation, you know, because they become desperate for money or, you know, for those links or those ties. And it can be very, you know, even though they've been rescued, as you say, a lot of times they are left vulnerable to people to take exploitation again.
Okay, well, let me ask that of Kevin as well. From your experience, is enough being done to help these victims, these young victims of exploitation?
Well, in a word, no. All around the world, in the UK, it doesn't really matter. We fail to do two key things. First, to build processes which protect the victims well and care for them well, and also then to just resource them and scale up those processes that should be taking care of people. There are better laws in some country, worse laws in others. The laws in the UK are okay, not the best in the world, certainly not the worst. All of these things need improvement. I suppose if there's any point of hope in this, I'll have to say that children who have been in slavery that I have known in different countries around the world, they just display an amazing resilience. I mean, they go through things that you don't believe any person could survive and hold their mind together ultimately. and yet they do. And they can heal, and they can grow, and they can become productive members, exciting members of a society.
Well, I guess that's one spark of good fortune in amongst all the misery. Kevin, thank you very much indeed for that. Kevin Bales and Debbie Beadle in the studio with me. And we end with our Insight Bite, a little something that we feel you should know. So let me ask you this. Did you have your breakfast before you left for work this morning? No? Well, a Portuguese rail operator has just launched a campaign urging its passengers to eat breakfast. Fertigus, which operates trains linking Lisbon to Setúbal, have been facing huge delays caused by passengers fainting during the morning rush hour. The company, which transports around 70,000 passengers a day, plans to give out apples and yogurts to passengers at its stations next week as part of its campaign to promote breakfast eating. That's all for now. I'm Shuli Ghosh. That was Insight.